I'm looking at it in terms of there's an issue here that relates to the development of the brand and the culture with it and the strategy that underpins it, because that informs then how we move the business forward. It aligns with the business strategy. But I can relate to, and I can just think of a bunch of them off the top of my head straight away, where it has been a really uncomfortable situation and there have been explosive moments. You would prefer if it didn't get so hot around the collar, that's for definite, but somebody has come to the table and they're carrying a load of things that they are feeling very heated about. But Dave has a very moderating influence in terms of, even if they are in safe hands, because even though it might feel like it's a very vulnerable place, and there are some aspects around the table that are just not in a good place, I have always felt in working with Dave that regardless of how fragile things might be at that time, and it's a short-term scenario, he will have them out on the other side in a much better place, and everybody will grow, and the business will perform, and the team will perform.
I don't have to be liked. I don't have to be popular. But I know what I've learned over the 15 years of doing this is that no matter what happens when I'm on site doing something, whether they like it or they don't like it, the way they value it is the impact. At the end, the aftertaste is, oh, that was a great session, Dave. And I go, in my mind, I'm going, what matters is what you're going to say about this and the impact it has in a month's time. That's what really matters.
You're inside and not inside the business. You're part of the business, but external to the business. And that liminal experience is incredibly powerful, but also is quite a skillful place to be. And I think you've exemplified, what it means to be skillful in that, which so many fractional executives need to learn. Because I don't think it's easy or obvious about how to be in that liminal place.
For me, improvising is being present, completely present with what's right in front of you. And that's a joyful place to be. And it's taken me time to get better and better and better at that, to be here sometimes, just to be completely here with what's here and notice that, and also meet people where they're at, sometimes to try and eliminate the judge in my head that sort of says they're good or they're bad or they're right or they're wrong or they're failing or succeeding. It's like they are where they are.
Welcome to the Fractional Frontier, where we explore the future of leadership in today's evolving business landscape. I'm Lorraine Carter, here with Charles McLachlan, and every week we dive deep into the world of high-performing fractional executives and the businesses that leverage them.
Whether you're an experienced fractional leader or a business decision maker seeking top-tier talent, this is the place to be for actionable insights, strategies, and stories from the front lines of fractional leadership.
And today, we're diving into the crucial topic of scaling businesses with seasoned fractional executive Dave Gribben, who will be sharing his insights and success stories. So Dave, can you start by telling our listeners a little bit about your background and what led you to become a fractional executive?
Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks, Charles. So I came into the world of work, but anytime I say this, it tends to remind me of my age. But anyway, I came into the world of work in the late 70s and sort of stumbled through a number of jobs back in the day, for those listeners that can remember those times when, the world was a different place and the economy was a different place. And I vowed I'd never get into either insurance or banking because my dad was involved in both. And the law of attraction came into place. And after stumbling around for a number of years, found myself coming into the insurance industry. And I came in as a salesperson. And I would proudly say that, I still am a salesperson. It was one of the best skill sets I ever got was, how to pitch an idea, how to persuade people, how to win business, how to keep clients. And in the work I do now, I would say it's probably one of the primary skills I have is that whole client piece, if you like. And then I got the opportunity through a series of events that happened quite early in my career when I was 25 to come into the world of management. And I became a sales manager of an insurance company, a UK insurer actually called Abbey Life. And here in Ireland got taken over by Canada Life. And that was in the late 80s, early 90s. And at the same time, bank assurance was becoming a thing. It was a thing in the United Kingdom and it was becoming a thing in Ireland. And Ulster Bank, one of the big four banks here, asked me would I head up their bank assurance business, which I did. And over 11 years, that sort of evolved into private banking and the investment side of the business, and some of our stockbroking activities as well. And I ended up, a little bit by design and a little bit by accident, becoming a business builder in the bank. And that's how I try to position myself from a brand point of view, from a personal brand point of view, that I saw myself as a business builder. And I had to teach the bank that idea. They gave me the opportunity to do some studies, which I got to do in the middle of the 90s in Trinity College, which was fantastic for a couple of years. And then I left, I would say, the world of big organizations in 2003, dare I say, in the good old days of banking. And my mum used to say to me, Dave, you're a free range chicken. And the more she had said that to me way back, the more I realized that she knew me nearly better than I knew myself, which was that deep inside myself, that I like to travel my own journeys. I like to do my own thing. I like to be unencumbered of too many, maybe people or responsibilities. And it's not that I can't take responsibility. I'm well able to, in the role even that I played in Ulster Bank. And I set up a business with a couple of people in the financial services world, which in essence was around financial advising high net worth individuals and looking after their pension assets. So we set up what was called a pensioner trustee business. And the long and the short of that was, from 03 to 09, we built a private business with 135 people in it. I was the CEO, so again, the business builder, and that was my thing. So what was really becoming clear to me along that entire journey, and I also had various coaches working with me on and off over that journey, was that what really lit my fire, what energized me, was the ability to grow businesses, to build leadership, to build top teams, to work with top teams, and the whole area of team performance and leadership performance, and understanding the science of it, and to be honest, more my lived experience of it. I was getting more and more intrigued and energized by it. And I realized that the more I acted as a CEO, the less I was getting to do that work. When you're in a regulated industry, you're spending a lot of your time on, for me, whilst it was important work, it wasn't incredibly meaningful work. And so I was coming to the conclusion, actually, as we were hurtling towards the financial crash, that actually, if I was to really, if you like, honor what I really wanted to do, I would be doing, top team coaching, leadership development, strategy for, businesses that want to grow. I would be doing that on a full-time basis. I had no idea what that looked like, but I felt that was what I'd love to do. And so for a couple of years running into 2009, I was beginning to socialize that idea. I was beginning to express it to our own board. And I guess a series of events all happened at the same time. I was wanting to get that done by the end of 2009. Financial crash starts happening. And then I bring the business through, my own business as it was, with a number of people, through a massive downsize, which was a great learning in itself. Not a very nice experience, but a very good learning. And we brought that business, for example, in headcount down from 135 people down to about 65 people quite quickly. It remains the biggest in its marketplace. So we did the right thing, probably ahead of where a lot of people felt we should have done it, but we did it. And I stepped out of it executively to set up what I now do. And so for the last 15 years, I've been working with all sorts of businesses in all sorts of industries across the world, mainly in Ireland, I'd have to say, but maybe 25% of the time outside of Ireland. Right now, from Asia, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, over to Miami, and everything in between, a lot in Europe, in all sorts of industries, pharma, tech, you pretty much name it, even sporting bodies. But what's sort of consistent in all of that is I'm working with top teams. So typically founder, CEO, C-suite team, helping them realize more of their own potential as a team, helping them strategize, working with them individually. And I guess nearly acting as a sort of a quasi CEO in some ways, not quasi CEO, maybe assistant CEO, helping the CEO with a lot of those type of aspects of their activities. So that's been the journey. It's been incredibly varied, particularly the last 15 years, because the last 15 years I've spent relatively little time in financial services and a lot of time in lots of the other industries that I had no real insight to until I started to work in them. So that's been 40 something years.
I can relate to free range chicken because we keep chickens, and I suppose we'll come back to this, but you know, the two things that, well, three things that really matter to free range chickens is one, they got a place to roost. The second thing is you need to make sure you keep clear of the foxes. And the final thing is you have to watch out for avian flu. And I suppose we could take that metaphor any which way we want later on in the conversation. But before we get into any of that, I really wanted to understand, you know, when you first come into an organization, whether it's an SME or a much larger enterprise, what are the things you look for? What's the first things you try and assess when you're coming in for the first time into an organization?
Yeah, I mean, when I come into an organization, well, the first thing I'm trying to understand is how do they make their money, or how are they planning to make their money. So that sort of economic model, if you like. And sometimes that's very robust and sometimes it's very tenuous. You know, obviously in a very uncertain world, it can be, I guess, more or less tenuous. Sometimes it has been considered, and sometimes it hasn't been considered in a long, long time. You know, yes, oh, you know, how do we turn €5 into €6 is often the way I put it. You know, how do you do that? What is the value equation? And even the posing of the question and the answering of the question can be very helpful in and of itself. So that would be one. The other would be to try and understand the marketplace. So, but, you know, understand the proposition and the marketplace. And, you know, if I give you an example, I do a lot of work in aviation finance. So work with aviation finance organizations, which have big balance sheets and small headcount. And, you know, it's easy to while it's a highly technical business at a level, in other words, understanding aircraft or understanding lease, it's actually a very simple business to understand. You know, they raise money, they buy aircraft and they lease them, and they get paid for the leases. That's essentially it. However, when you get down into the detail of it and begin to understand, well, actually, what does that involve? You realize it involves lots of different things in terms of, you know, the competitive landscape, trying to understand it. The geopolitical environment impacts that industry hugely. You know, obviously recent wars and COVID and things like that have seriously impacted that industry. And even current events, you know, are impacting that industry. But it's actually quite an easy industry to understand. So that would be another aspect. The other is the leadership itself. Is like, how does leadership impact this organization, and how important is leadership, and particularly the leadership team? So a question I'd ask early on in looking at a business or speaking with a business is, you know, how critical is the leadership team to the overall delivery of the long-term objectives of the business? And you know, you would imagine the answer is always high, but it isn't actually always high. Sometimes there's a pause when I ask that question, and it's, yeah, actually a good question. The answer doesn't have to be 10 out of 10. It could be, you know, 6 out of 10. It could be 7 out of 10. So trying to understand that and understand the rationale for that. I don't come in and suggest that it has to be 10 out of 10. I just want to know how they see it. And then as a look at to what degree is leadership living up to its full potential in that context, and trying to get their take on that as well. And that tends to legitimize, you know, whether I have relevance, because to be honest, I've rarely come across a business that says leadership doesn't matter and the team that we have here is living up to its full potential. It tends to be the other way around. Leadership really does matter, and we could live up to a lot more of our potential. And then I get into, what would that look like? If you were living up to more of your own potential with the existing leadership resources you have, what would be different around here? So just trying to try and turn that into something real in their minds, at least. Strategy would be another. What is the strategy, and why is the strategy the strategy? Would be another aspect. Sometimes brand. I don't put myself forward as a brand expert, but I understand brand at the level I need to understand it. So how, what is your brand? Do you understand it? How does it play into the marketplace? What value do you get from it? I find that big businesses understand this because they have the resources and the expertise, and they're dealing with agencies to understand it. I find small businesses don't. When I say, smaller businesses, maybe, 100, 200 people type businesses, tend not to really understand brand. They understand product and services, but they don't understand brand. That's where I tend to start. And the reason I start there is because that's where really what I'm trying to do is establish the ground and my own relevance, to be honest. And also, it's typically a founder and a CEO is to understand how the founder and the CEO are doing. So to be honest, sometimes my conversations when I do get in to do work are often as business-like as they are personal, because if the CEO is well and is managing themselves well and feels well, there's a very high chance everything else can be well or is well. And the opposite is also true. So sometimes in my work, and that applies to teams as well, sometimes I work in teams and frankly the team isn't well, and it could be because the vitality is incredibly low and the pressure is too high and they're not looking after themselves, and they may be causing themselves their own problems. So that's how I tend to scan around in a very common sense type way and try and keep things simple. It's not to try and make these things complex, because they're complex at a level, but they're actually very simple at another level, but they're not easy. When you get in to try and move the dial on things, that's when the fun starts, if you like.
Well, anything around human nature and behavior is always a challenge, invariably. That kind of brings me on to that question then, if we're looking at, considering that a lot of our audience are SMEs as opposed to enterprise type organizations, and you've mentioned interesting there in terms of headcount scenario and different, particularly when it comes to brand. Where do you see fractional leadership? Well, it is actually becoming a lot more popular, particularly amongst SMEs, but what do you see as the primary reasons for those more modestly resourced businesses turning to fractional executives like yourself, Dave?
I think, like in my case, if you just broadly call it lead, like at one level, you could call me a top team coach, and I do position myself like that. But so I guess there is very little know-how, to be honest, in my experience, around teaming at the top level. I go as far as to say at any level. And I'll give you an example. I do some lecturing in universities here in Ireland around high performing teams, and I do it typically for MBA programs, so mid-level executives in all sorts of businesses, and many of your listeners may be on those type of programs. And that by their very nature, they break people into teams to work on projects. And all hell breaks loose because, people think that they're well able to operate in teams, but when they're put in a group of strangers, early on a program to work on a project, it can get incredibly difficult. Most people who've gone through MBA programs don't have a very positive experience of working in teams on projects on those programs. Hence, they bring me in. But I have 2 or 3 questions I ask at the start, and that is, could we have a quick show of hands as to who is formally trained in leading and operating in high performing teams? Not a single hand goes up. How many of you need to be able to operate, either lead or operate in a high performing team to get your job done? All hands go up. And you go, that's sort of interesting, isn't it? And typically those people are in their 30s and early 40s on these programs. So here we meet people well into their careers, and they're in teams, and there's this assumption that they should just be able to work in teams because they're smart people. So
it's fascinating, because I think with my background in software development, I've seen a huge movement in changing from sort of top-down management to a style of engagement of software development, which was called extreme programming, which is really allowing the software developers to run the process. And then it swung the other way. But I do think that in the software development community, there is a fundamental experience of team for those who aren't just the lone wolves who go and sit in a corner and do magic stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've owned this may be coincidence or not. I've started to work with two IT teams, that I'm just getting to know. Um, their challenge is twofold. One is, the various projects they're trying to deliver in their organizations are they're going reasonably well, but the sort of clunkiness is those project teams, which include the users and all of that. So there isn't a skill set that sort of says, when we put the project team together, do we know what we mean when we put the project team together? And do we know what the purpose of it is and how it should work and all of that? What the IT team are realizing is we need to be good at that because we're constantly forming teams to run projects with users. And the other is their own team themselves. So they are actually a group of IT people themselves who all do very different things, from AI to cybersecurity to all sorts of other things. And they're realizing they're very, very different people, but they actually are one team. And what is their sort of collective agenda? And so I'm only sort of getting sort of familiar with this right now. And that's really interesting. Just, Charles, as you mentioned, IT. Yeah, it is. It's I earn a living out of it. So, in some ways I'd sort of say, I'm happy for the world to carry on, not, educating people into the workforce and giving them a really good skill set around teams. But look, I'm being a bit facetious when I say that. I think organizations would do much better, but back if they did. But back to your question, I think it's because they realize, actually, yes, we have a deficit here. The reason they know they have a deficit is either they're just sort of instinctively enlightened to the fact that actually we don't have a skill set here. I think we're missing some opportunities, or more often we have a pain point. We have a problem, and the problem is in the team, and can you help us fix it? But of course that problem is a symptom to an underlying problem, which is maybe you haven't formed the team properly and there's a load of fundamental building blocks that are just not in play, or we just don't even have an understanding of what we mean when we say team. So I think it's and the interesting thing for me is I wouldn't say it's radically different from I work in a couple of startups all the way up to very large organizations. I don't think it's a whole lot different, to be honest. In many ways, startups have less of a problem because they tend to be a small group of people with a common purpose, so they have got something to unite them very quickly. So yeah, it's
really interesting that you don't see that, because
no.
the contrast between a startup environment or a business of 10 to 20 people is radically different from one that's sort of like 1 to 2,000. So
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you're seeing so many parallels. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think the difference is the context. So if you've I'm just think of a skincare startup I'm involved in. They're a small group of people. You can put them in one room, and they're all talking to each other every day, and they're going through the rough and tumble of startup, lots of success, lots of failure, etc. It's actually quite easy to be united around that. So the uniting force is right in front of you. People are bought in not because they expect to earn tons of money today by the very nature. So they're brought in at a very purpose level, if you like. So that can be very helpful in a team. When you go to a 2,000 person organization, as you cited, Lorraine, it's sometimes that aspect has got lost. That's got lost because it's back in the sort of heritage of the business somewhere, years back. And what you're trying to do is rekindle what is relevant in terms of purpose today, on top of the fact that what's common amongst both is there isn't really a developed skill set around teams. So for the startup, if funnily enough, they need less of it because they've got the uniting force, and we figure things out and we're prepared for things to be a bit rough around the edges. Whilst in a big business, we expect things to work properly, to be done right first time. There's loads of people educated around the place. We've got experts, we've got a learning and development department, a HR department, all of these type of things. So there's this illusion that actually we should be good at this. Not true a lot of the time,
And that can even when I think of just areas of where I've overlapped into, say, where brand and culture, that you've got that whole scenario of, yes, you can, it's much more tangible in terms of the daily experience in a smaller organization. If you have that sophistication or understanding where you've had exposure to building brand and culture in that context, but then trying to scale that out
Yeah.
with teams so that it's still a living part and you don't have 250 over here and another 300 over here, and really they're like two different universes.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit like, from your culture and branding work, like branding is slightly different in the sense that a large business might have a whole marketing function, and somebody who's come from an agency and understands brand, or is going to hire an agency and they know what they're doing. And obviously, in a small business, you just may have nobody in the organization who, well, the worst of all is they think they understand brand, but they don't. And so they get, that becomes really problematic. That's most common. Whilst the interesting thing in around teams and leadership is that, a lot of people who start businesses, and indeed who end up running large businesses as CEOs, have come from a technical background like accountancy or law or engineering and those type of backgrounds. And a lot, I'm thinking of even healthcare. I work in a few healthcare settings. And they all openly and honestly say, I have no training in this leadership. I didn't ever went, I've done maybe a small leadership program here or there, but I don't really have a developed skill set. And nobody's holding my feet to the fire and saying, I have to get better at leadership or I have to get better at high performing teams. They are holding my feet to the fire on deliver the numbers, get the product sold or whatever it might be. And so it doesn't get the same attention. And I'm not sure. I haven't experienced, maybe this is because of how I come into organizations. Most organizations are quite happy that I deal with, are happy to say, you're the person we work with around this stuff. And even though CEOs and people around me clearly develop a better understanding and more know-how, there's no question they do. They're quite happy to say, well, it's nice to have somebody who's much more specialist and expert in this. And I'll honestly also sometimes gets more energized by it, because I think you have to be interested in human nature and human dynamics to enjoy being in teams.
I suppose that brings me to sort of two questions relating to the fractional aspect of your life. One is, why do organizations pick up fractional executives rather than want to have a full-time person or have a HR person who's competent in what you do? And the second thing is, you've worked as full-time leadership in building teams. How different is it when you're working fractional? So what's the fractional dimension of your experiences?
Yeah, well, I think, like, if I just think about a bunch of clients in my mind at the minute, like, why do they have me there? I would say objectivity. I won't put these in any particular order of priority, but I would just put them together. I think being objective, being a fresh pair of eyes, coming in, once a week or whatever I might do, into their team setting or into whatever setting I'm in. You are a fresh pair of eyes. You start to, as somebody said to me years ago, you start to see the wallpaper in their own house that people don't notice themselves. So that's definitely the case. And even if you're coming in regularly, I was with a client this morning who was my first ever client. So it's a client of 15 years. And we were sort of reflecting on that. And still to this day, when I go into their business, they're in the world of fashion. And they deal all across the world as wholesalers, but they're retailers here in Ireland. And they are always amazed with what I can see. But that's because, between the gaps between I'm seeing them and seeing them the next time, I've seen 15 other businesses and my mind has gone into all sorts of other places. So they're always fresh to me. So that'd be one. Specialist know-how for sure. Is another. Another would be that, my nature is I won't deal with an organization unless I can sort of more connect at a heart level as well as a head level. So I do care, and the business I deal with matter to me. And like, it's not that I say that at the start because it could sound a bit trite. I think they'll say, actually, Dave cares about what we're trying to do here. So therefore I can bring much more of myself to what I do. And, I think the nature of that relationship, whilst other people in their organization will care, I'll sometimes care in a way that I'll challenge incredibly hard, because I'm not trying to preserve a full-time job here. So I get the opportunity to put challenges into play that I know, and I've been around others who won't do it because they feel the cost of potential disagreement is too high. Whilst for me, the cost of, maybe a challenge that people find too difficult to bear could be that, I'm not seen again. And I'm okay with that, actually, for my professional integrity. And in fact, those consequences don't really happen. Would be another. Cost efficiency, fixed cost versus variable cost, sort of pretty obvious one. I think sometimes people find it easier to say, well, you're not a full-time, you're not an FTE, as I used to call it, and so you're not on that number, so I can take you in another way. It would be another. Bigger impact would be another. I think you can, it's again, another client I was dealing with in the food industry this afternoon was saying that, you say things when you're with our team that this is the CEO saying to me, that I have said many times, but because you have said it, it's like they're listening to you. And sometimes the messenger matters, to be honest. And the last one that would come to mind would be, I am actually bringing an awful lot of what I'm learning all the time from other businesses into everything I'm dealing with. So there's that idea. They know that. So when I say, what I'm seeing working in organizations is, and that will be current and it will be relevant, because, we're all living in the same world, although we're all looking at it and seeing it differently. So they be the sort of main things.
So that's the benefits to the client that you're noticing. I suppose the other question is, how does it feel for you in this fractional role compared to when you were doing those full-time leadership roles, building a business, whether it was for Abbey Life or whoever?
Yeah, I've never been asked that question. That's a great question. It actually feels better for me, but that's because of how I'm wired. So I feel more unencumbered to do specifically what I can really do. So I'm not having to calculate anything else. I can come in. I mentioned that free range chicken earlier on. That's what's coming straight to my mind. I can come in and do my thing and not have to worry about anything else. So whilst I'm well able to manage politics and I'm well able to look after, my own reputation in an organization, I don't actually have to overcare for it. And I can come in, do my thing. I don't have to be liked. I don't have to be popular. But I know what I've learned over the 15 years of doing this is that no matter what happens when I'm on site doing something, whether they like it or they don't like it, the way they value it is the impact. At the end, the aftertaste is, oh, that was a great session, Dave. And I go, in my mind, I'm going, what matters is what you're going to say about this and the impact it has in a month's time. That's what really matters. That's how you're really going to assess it. Because if you're going to cut the next check to me, it's going to be based on that. Yeah, I keep an eye on that. So I'm very bottom line orientated. Like I'm good. I think I'm pretty good with relationships. I'm not the type of person that people will sort of feel, not this guy again, we don't like him. But I am very bottom line in terms of, I want to make sure that when you're assessing whether I'm actually contributing here, that you're getting a whole lot more value than you're paying for me.
Well, given your background, Dave, and how you came to all this, I'd be very surprised if it was other than that.
Oh, well, thank you. But I think it's how I'm wired. I think yeah, exactly. When you're running businesses, you're very bottom line. I mean, the other thing to say, which is slightly away from that exact question, is I tend to contract with the CEO, not exclusively, but I tend to contract with the founder or the CEO, because that's where I've come from, and I understand that world, and I understand the top table. And I like it. I mean, apart from understanding, I get energy from it. So I think a lot of CEOs sort of say in their mind, and they've said it to me openly, you sort of get my world. And I think that resonance is really important, apart from my know-how, to be honest. It's like, you have a background in this, you've gone through the ups and downs of it, some of the stuff that I might be going through. So this isn't academic to you. This is very real. So I think that goes along with it.
There's that familiar claim, it's lonely at the top if you're a CEO, and if you're a companion to the CEO, then that can be extremely valuable. But I suppose the other thing I was going to ask is, you talk about wanting to make sure you're creating value month by month. But to what extent do you find you have to explicitly draw your attention to the clients that you were the person who created the value, rather than just assume that because you were there at the time, they'll recognize it was you?
Yeah, it's a really good one. I think when I'm thinking of a law firm I started working with about 3 years ago, and I just think we did this pretty well, is we sat down at the start with the managing partner and a couple of the partners, and we went to the end, and we knew we were going on a sort of about a 3-year journey. It continues to this day, but we sort of said this is sort of like a 3-year journey. They had certain goals, and we literally wrote them out, and we sort of said, look, this is what we're specifically trying to achieve in 3 years. There was lots of things in there. They wanted to develop a leadership capability in their partner group. They wanted to get people primed for equity partner. There was all sorts of things. There was other solicitors they wanted to bring through to partner and so on, and there were other agendas as well. And we wrote them all out, and then they were very detailed orientated, and that suits me as well, in that we literally created a document, and it was only a page and a half, and we said, this is the document that we will use to refer to as to whether this is working or not. Now, that's when you just have to use your experience and your instinct and know that you're dealing with the right client to say, how reasonable are we going to be in our understanding of whether this is working or not. And that's when it's just common sense, and we do review this, and we do have very good conversations about it, and we sit down and we say, how many of these boxes are we ticking, and I would ask the question, what's your take on the impact I'm having? If I wasn't here, would that have got done? And sometimes the answer is yes, it would, but it wouldn't have worked out quite that well, or it wouldn't have worked out quite as quick. And you go, okay, so there's maybe where the value is. And I'm good with that, because sometimes you just have to assess things using your common sense. And other times we got that thing done at that time, box ticked, and it's much easier to assess. So yeah, and I mean, sometimes I have to teach them how they establish value, and because, they're not thinking of it that way. So for example, in top teams, it's not just about, for example, delivering the bottom line financial goals of the business, which is maybe sometimes where a CEO might start. We need to grow this thing by 20% per annum or whatever. But it could be we want to actually develop leadership capacity and future succession. Oh, yeah, I never thought about that. Well, is that part of what we're trying to do here as well? Because it doesn't have to be, but is it? Yes, it is. Okay, let's put that on the agenda. And you can keep going with other things as well, like what impact is this leadership team looking to have across the wider organization, in terms of leadership, culture, anything, even retention of our best people. So you can go anywhere with this stuff. I'm thinking of those last few with some aviation lessors I deal with, where it's not just about getting all the deals done and making money. You're actually trying to build a business as well as run the business. So I tend to go into the sort of run activities, which is about today, and the build activities, which is more about tomorrow, type stuff, and get them to think that way.
That would be almost fair to say, which is what we'd often reflect on. It's not just the strategic, it's also at times rolling up your sleeves in terms of operationally, or is this actually, now this is the overall picture strategically, theoretically, but how well have the sleeves been rolled up, and do you get those occasions when you actually have to do that, Dave, just to get the ball?
Yeah, so I call my business Enable, and which means to make able. And I have a strap line called, just simply says, better business. So the reason I call it that is that back in 2009, somebody asked me a very deep question that took me quite a long while to answer. And the question was, what are you living for? So this was when I was going through that sort of transition. I'd call it more than a transition. It was like a pivot, a career pivot back in 2009, which I mentioned earlier. And the word enable came up. When I look back on my life thus far and looked at all the various things I'd done, including how I parented my kids and all of those things, I thought, actually, Dave, one of the things you get your energy from, and looks like you're pretty good at, is enabling others. So that became a positioning for me with clients. So when I'm with a client, I sort of say, I position myself as an enabler. So to your question then, I roll up the sleeves in that context. So I'll roll up my sleeves alongside other executives to enable them. And so it's not like I'll roll in there and I'll just go in and fix that thing and then come out but there's no enabling left. I don't do that. For the most part, don't do that. Like, obviously, I care about my clients. If there's something that needs to be resolved and I feel I can help resolve it, you know, I won't be shy of doing that. But for the most part, I try and act as an enabler. And I love rolling my sleeves up. I love getting involved in real things. And the messy stuff for me, and I'm thinking of a team I was dealing with yesterday, is you find yourself in the middle of teams and their stuff and their difficulties and their disagreements and their fallouts, and I've had all colours of it, and you're in the middle of it. You realise you're not a spectator in the room. You're actually part of the conversation as long as you're in the room. So your sleeves are well rolled up, and you can't sort of say, well, listen, guys, when you're finished your disagreement, I'll come back in again as your team coach. You don't have that option. You know, you're in here, and that's it. And so what can you do to help them actually get through this in some better way? And I'm just thinking of an incident yesterday where that was very much the case. And, you know, it wasn't a happy experience for everyone, but it was a worthwhile experience for everyone. And I was certainly alive in the middle of it, and it was good, and it required a lot of my attention and energy. But I felt safe in it, you know, but it was a sleeve rolled up moment for sure. Yeah.
Well, if you're reflecting on that, to expand on that a little more, could you actually share so that it becomes even more tangible? Can you share, for example, a success story where you helped an SME significantly, say, outperform their competitors, and what that role in terms of how you were the catalyst as a fractional leader playing a role in helping that happen? Because I can certainly relate to my own experience being embroiled in very dysfunctional team experiences where there's a huge amount of tension and you're in the thick of trying to help resolve that. But it would be great to hear about how you've been that catalyst for that success, where one of the clients you've worked with, because of your input, has really helped them outperform.
Yeah, I mean, like slightly unusual business. I continue to work in a large dental chain. It's now a large dental chain, but it wasn't when I started. I knew nothing about dentistry except being on the other side of dentistry. And I bumped into, and it's maybe even a little bit about how you find work, is I was actually invited by a client to a corporate box to a U2 concert. So I can say U2 because I'm sure all the listeners know U2. And in the box there's a dentist who happens to be the husband of one of my clients. And we have a conversation, and he says very openly to me, look, I'm trying to build out a chain of dental practices, and I'm a dentist, and I've had a go at this, and I'm running into some challenges. And the challenges are, I'm realizing that, you know, I'm spending most of my time at the dental chair doing my dentistry, and at the same time I'm trying to build a dental practice, and I'm finding that I'm realizing actually building a business is a completely different thing than doing dentistry. And that's sort of where it started. And I've heard about you, can you help me? And so I have been working alongside him, and the first thing we did was we sat together for a day, and I unpacked his head, frankly, to sort of say, what are you trying to do? What's your ambition? And got that really well articulated. He loved the process of somebody just listening to him for a day and sort of playing it out. And at the end of that day, I had unpacked the real ambition he wanted, that he had, in an incredibly, you know, intellectual way, but in a really heartfelt way. We had focused on the 6 big things that we felt at that time what we needed to focus on to make that ambition a reality. And we came out after that day doing that. And there was big things around what that looked like, frankly, was, you know, the start point was we needed to actually get a little bit of management capacity into the business to run the day-to-day stuff. So there was whole practice manager stuff initially. Then there was, like, you know, there was this starting to get the groups of all the dentists and the hygienists and the various other people together to have conversations with me as to what type of practice they wanted to build culturally and every other way. Then we brought a branding agency in. He had a branding agency, I should say, that he brought in, that he had been peripherally dealing with, brought them in properly to sort of like, what are we? And, you know, create a proper brand. And they're in the middle of that work actually at the minute as I speak. And then we started to look at, how do we open up new practices? So we have done 2 new organic, and we have done 3 by acquisition. I go to see one of those for the first time next week down in County Cork. And on it goes. And like now it's, we're talking 50, 60 people in a business, and it's going to keep going. They and we've now got prop. So what I've been doing there was, you could argue, step 1 was more about strategy. Then it was more about really helping him recruit, helping him develop, sort of a cultural sort of understanding, helping him in the branding conversations, was more attending those meetings and helping him interpret what was going on and bringing that into reality in the business. And now it's more just, I would use that phrase earlier on. It's like, a deputy CEO, even though you wouldn't use a CEO title in a dental practice. We're working alongside him on a monthly basis and just, marching on and executing our strategy. Now we started that about 4 years ago, and we're currently re-strategizing because we've delivered on a lot of the strategy and the ambition that we first set out, and now we're recutting it. But along there as well, like, I mean, I'm learning more about dentistry and how fabulous it is as an industry, but how actually challenging it is. So if you're a dentist, and I don't know if you know any dentists, you spend pretty much all your day in a room over a chair with patients underneath you. And it can be very challenging, like really, really challenging. And it's one after the next, after the next. It's a really hard job to do 5 days a week. In fact, generally recommended you don't do it 5 days a week. Because it's just so intensive. So, there's been loads of that aspects have come into it as well, well-being. And we've, I could talk to you for hours about, all of the nuance around how do you sustain performance. And that's where I've gone with them. It's like, we now have a model we know that works. We've got a brand that's coming into the marketplace. Now what we've got to be able to do is sustain this. In other words, create the proverbial flywheel that will just keep turning here. And that's where we're at the minute. You might call that sort of more finessing of that business, but actually that's, I'm finding really interesting. It's one thing doing dentistry, but how do you optimize that? And then we get into, for example, one other thing is like, which might sound incredibly crude, is like return on chair, which sounds like really odd. It's a phrase I gave them. But you've got a chair in a room with all this equipment. It costs a lot of money. So you've got to get a return on that. So ideally you want a patient in that chair all the time.
Like a barbershop.
Correct, like a barbershop. But you can't have the same dentist in the room all the time. So that's now where we're at going. So how do you maximize that? And they're putting, they've got, they're starting to look at what they're doing and they're really up for it. Like, to be honest, they're leading me more than I'm leading them, which is great credit to them, around bringing in best business practices on how they look at the investment they're making, and also how they look at, they're not trying to turn it into a sweatshop. How do we make sure our dentists are well? Because obviously well and energized dentists do better work, obviously. So those type of
suicide rates in the dental profession are pretty scary.
Say that again?
Suicide rates in the dental profession in the UK are very scary. I think the only other profession which is worse is farmers. Yeah,
and you're seeing, and I think, and I don't have deep insight to it, Charles. I think one of the reasons is that most dentists, certainly in Ireland, were a single dentist, a single chair, in a single location. So that was the problem, given everything I've said. Whilst if you're part of a dental practice where there might be 15 dentists, and you're saying, well, I have 3.5 days that I do every week, that's my thing. And I've the working hours I'm looking for because it fits my life. There's a much better chance that that's going to be healthy. And I think that we're finding this here in Ireland with GPs, where GPs are moving into these bigger corporate structures and all of that. And whilst you can look at it from a consumer point of view and see, well, there's much bigger clinics, more doctors. It's actually very good for doctors and their well-being. And I think you're going to see more and more of that in the healthcare profession. Dermatologists here in Ireland, I work in dermatology as well. And it's the same thing. That's a lot of the healthcare professions are realizing there's a better model. Yeah.
I was intrigued by a term that Lorraine used, which is, how much are you a catalyst in what you do? And I suppose my question is not a catalyst, because in chemical terms, a catalyst is unchanged but slowly gets poisoned, but a reagent. How much do you get changed through the processes that you're engaging?
How much do I get changed? That's a good question. That's a good. There's no doubt at all in my mind that my lived experience of just being in businesses, sometimes trial and erroring, I'm learning tons of stuff. No, absolutely no question. I unapologetically say that to people. It's my lived experience a lot of the time I'm bringing to you. Like, I have some formalized experience, but it's really that lived experience. Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I yeah, gosh, that is just such a great question. I don't have a really simple answer to that. It's just a fact I need to think about that, actually. I think I'm becoming I think when you meet a very diverse range of people, I'm even thinking of the last 2 weeks, I've been dealing into the US, quite a bit into Singapore, a little bit into China, working with teams here in Ireland, always very diverse in terms of culture, nationalities, and all the rest. And I didn't really, when I was in Ulster Bank, there wasn't a lot of that, I'd have to say. And also, when you're in one industry, without overly stereotyping, you get certain types of people. So I don't get that at all. So you're into so many different types of people. I think I've become over time quite worldly. And so I'm finding that I can go into any situation very, very quickly and be trusted really fast and get what's happening really quick. And I haven't, until you've asked that question, really thought about that. But I'm thinking tomorrow, for example, I've got 20 people for a day in a financial services business, actually. And I know one person in the room. I've only ever worked with the CEO. And his slight concern is how long it's going to take for me to get them engaged. I've no concern. Now, it's not because there's no ego in that for me. I just have no concern. So there's something has developed in me, which is my ability to understand the art of facilitation, because I think it's as much a science as an art. And I think you just get better at it the more you do of it, and tune into what will be in front of me and work with what's in front of me. So I think that's developed quite a lot. Outside of my professional life, I find I'm much more fascinated by people. I would have said if you met me leaving the world of banking 15 years, or the world of financial services 15 years ago, I would stay in my lane, is the way I'd put it, and stay in my comfort area and be a perfectly reasonable person in there. Now I feel I just love, if we travel, which we do quite a bit, I just love interacting with everybody without overdoing that. But I love interacting with everybody, and I'm fascinated by everybody. So if I check into a hotel, I'm fascinated by what's going on. And if something stirs my curiosity, I'll ask. And sometimes my wife is going, "What are you asking?" I'm like, "Guys, it sounds fascinating. How do they do that? Or where do they get?" So I find, and I've seen people do that many times, but I've never thought of myself as one of those people. And I find I'm much more like that. Because I think you have to being a fractional executive anyway. You have to go in with massive curiosity, be very, very open, ask stupid questions. What I'm finding is it's great fun, and you learn so much, and actually you get incredible insight. And sometimes you catalyze a great insight on the other side. Oh, like you've just done. You've asked me a great question. Gosh, I never thought about that. That's fascinating.
So now we know why the chicken crosses the road, don't we?
Yes, exactly.
Chicken analogy is going to be really here, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I was about to say, Charles, given the amount of fractional executives what would be really interesting is how, with Dave's answer to that, and I'm just even reflecting on, there are so many parallels with what Dave has shared that I would have as an experience working across a diverse spectrum of clients in different countries. And I can relate to so much of what he's talking about, like where you literally parachute in and you are in the moment of dealing with that and bringing all of your experience and expertise to the table. And some of it can be a very challenging environment, working through all those, challenges that might be there within the group. But given what Dave's described to us, are you seeing those patterns then amongst all the different fractional executives you work with and that you know?
I think it's partly about personality. So there are some people who find a comfort zone and then they really plow that furrow. And there are other people who, have this relentless curiosity and always want to do new things. So I can think of a fractional FD, and he's found that he really likes working with charities and impact organizations. Now, I think they're really difficult organizations to work with, but he really likes working with those. And so he's found a furrow to plow. But then I think of somebody else who they constantly want to move on. So they are they're always trying to reinvent themselves. They're always trying to extend their reach. They're always trying to use what they did last time as a platform to do something new. And that for them, it's the excitement of a new place, a new situation, a new group of people, and that really keeps them going. But they've fundamentally got this relentless curiosity. And then there are other people who just love the improvisation. I think some of the people I work with, I say, go on an improv course, learn how to do improvisation, because actually a lot of what you're doing when you land up in these organizations, you just have to improvise.
I would agree with that. What you're bringing up for me, Charles, when you say it as well, is that one of the kicks I get out of it is relationship. I like for me, there has to be a relationship. I love the opportunity, as I often say with a lot of my facilitation when I'm getting groups together, is, this will be highly unstructured, but very purposeful. So don't ask me for the 7-point agenda, because that presumes I have one, but I know why we're here. I know why, and I will help you get there. And I do now, it's not without being cocky. I trust that I can do that because I can, as you say, deal with what's in front of me. For me, improvising is being present, completely present with what's right in front of you. And that's a joyful place to be. And it's taken me time to get better and better and better at that, to be here sometimes, just to be completely here with what's here. And notice that, and also meet people where they're at. Sometimes that, to try and eliminate the judge in my head that sort of says they're good or they're bad or they're right or they're wrong or they're failing or succeeding. It's like they are where they are. And as I get to know people better, I'm always so glad I didn't judge them, because people have stories that have them where they are. Whether that's a good or a bad place doesn't really matter, and that's a great lesson as well in so many ways.
But Lorraine, I'd be interested in your perspective, because in some ways Dave is describing himself as being anything to anybody, and yet you're always talking about building a personal brand. What would the question you'd be asking him about, his personal brand versus his I'm anybody to any, I can be anything to anybody?
Well, when I'm reflecting on that question, I'm also reflecting on that there are actually consistencies in how Dave is describing himself. But so there are consistencies, and also having collaborated and worked with Dave, there are definitely consistencies in terms of mindset, approach, and how he works with people. But it's like anything, like I describe myself as a practitioner, leader, and knowledge transfer or tutor, but you bring to the fore what's relevant in that context in terms of what you're trying to help deliver as a positive outcome with whomever you're working. And sometimes those aspects are more dominant in the role and what you're delivering, but there are consistencies. So somebody might have had an association say they work with me and they've just seen me in an operational role, or maybe on another occasion. But I know from experience that the personal brand still needs to be consistent regardless of where the highlighted area of role of delivery is. So my experience of just even listening to Dave, but also having had the experience of working with him, is that there is a consistency in the personal brand, which he has already described to us. But what he's doing is he's amplifying in the moment in terms of where he focuses to help deliver an outcome. And I can relate to that, having worked across so many sectors, is you are pulling in from other experiences and approaches, which might be from completely different sectors or different cultures in different parts of the world, to try and help catalyze and enable a result or an outcome, some of which you will lead the client towards, some of which you will operationally actually implement within a structure or framework, or at least transfer the knowledge. So I don't feel that Dave here is being inconsistent from a personal brand point of view. I think he's working at a very high level as a fractional leader who's enabling the people he's working with and the organizations to be more successful by identifying and recognizing where in that time, in terms of what the outcomes are, to achieve that outcome. And that doesn't mean he has to bring everything he's good at to the table. It means he's bringing what's most relevant at that time.
Yeah, I mean, and if it was to build on that, there are things I won't do. And when I say won't do, I don't want to put myself forward as an expert on, even though I've come from the world of finance, for example, I don't put myself forward as a finance expert. However, I understand finance. I can have an intelligent finance conversation. But I've often brought other people in to say, there's somebody who will really specialize in the HR space for you, or really specialize in the marketing space, or really specialize in the finance space. I think for me, I like to go on journeys with businesses. So I'm not a plug in, plug out sort of, a fractional executive. So I'm really curious as to where is a business trying to go? Why is it trying to go there? And let's go, if I can be part of that journey, not that I need to be, but if I'm relevant to be part of that journey, then see me in that sort of strategic, long-term sort of way. And that doesn't mean you have to be committed to me for years, but as it happens, I have been involved in many businesses for a long, long time on a fractional basis, some much longer than others. I do like, and then if you were to get really practical and say, well, what is the lane I'm actually in? It's essentially developing leadership and leadership teams. That's essentially it. So if somebody believes that developing leadership capacity and leadership team capacity will really move the dial, then I'm relevant. If not, I'm not relevant. Simple as. And when you go in that space, there's a lot of other things that bubble out of it, that because of where that, as you allude to, Lorraine, where that's positioned, you're right at the top of the organization, and there's so many places I could go that I get asked to go that I don't go, because I'd be all over the place, and then I wouldn't be really enjoying it as much as I enjoy it, and maybe I wouldn't be as impactful because I'd get diluted a bit, I think. And the other thing, just last thing in that context that I experience as a fractional executive is you can get overplayed. So in other words, Dave Gribben can't be the answer to everything, so it's, and sometimes it's time to know when it's time up and move on. And I think that's a good thing. I've chaired a business for the last 10 years. I started as a fractional executive. Then they asked me to be the chairman of the business, which I did. There was a set of circumstances back in the past, and I did. And I came on board. Manufacturing business, knew nothing about it. And then over the last, and so I worked with the leadership team and did all the things I do as a fractional executive, but I also chaired the board. And in the last 2 years, we got into a process, the shareholders got into a process with me of, we want to sell the business. The shareholders were the leadership team. And anyway, we sold the business and it got executed 2 weeks ago. So this is very current for me. But in the months running up, because I was also speaking to the buyers, the potential buyers, I knew they didn't need somebody like me around. They were a much bigger organization. And I sort of sensed it wasn't really their thing. And I said to my colleagues of the last 10 years, I don't think I'm going to be part of the new arrangement. And I'm totally good with that. The last thing you want is, some obligation to me because I've been hanging around for the last 10 years. I've no interest in that at all. I have to be relevant, full stop. Our friendships can continue. And, they gave me a call last Friday. It was a lovely call to sort of gently let me down and sort of say, I think we've come to the end. And I sort of finished their sentence and I said, sure, I told you this 6 months ago. I'm totally good with this. You weren't in my cash flows, by the way. We're all good here. And so there's times when it's a good thing. Everything must move on. And I think that's an important part of fractional executive. If you can nearly get ahead of that,
Yeah.
Particularly if relationships are very close, because when you go on journeys, you do build relationships and it's a beautiful thing, but you don't want to abuse that. You want to be able to separate the professional side of that from the personal side of that. And that's been a bonus prize in this journey, is I've made a lot of friends, like people I would call friends, and I've been at the weddings of, families of clients, and that's been a lovely thing to do. And that, but I have to be really careful of, and we've been good at, is keeping them separate. I don't want them to be obliged to me because of that friendship, because for me it's like I'm grateful to say I have enough demand coming my way not to need that type of relationship, because that tends not to end brilliantly, not necessarily in a particular blow up, but it tends not to end terribly well. So I've had that experience too.
And that kind of then brings me on to the question then, just to because it kind of fits in the context of what we've just covered, is and also just reflecting on how you and I got to know and work together, Dave, is how do you see, given the breadth of the different organizations and teams you've worked with, is how do you see the role of collaboration, where fractional executives come in with different skill sets, but to help deliver, because working the two of you together or the three of you together within that organization can deliver a powerful outcome? Or do you see that it's more often more effective in a lone ranger capacity?
Yeah, a bit of both. I think, for me, ideally, if you can create a team sort of context around that at some level, like a project, that's a good thing to do. Sometimes I'm sort of woven into the leadership team. It's like, I'm thinking of even Christmas that's just gone by. You get invited to the leadership team dinner and you go, you're part of the gang, that sort of thing. And in others, I don't ever expect that. And it doesn't, I don't need to be going to dinners every night, but it's nice when you sort of are included in that way. So sometimes that's the environment. You're actually part of the team, even though you're not at every team meeting, you're not on site all the time. And sometimes you're part of a sort of a project. And I like that too, where there's other fractional executives, including yourself. And the contribution I make to that is to try and get the principles of a good working team going. And I might be, for the most part, I am deferred to as, you're sort of the expert in that. Will you help us pull that together? Not because they don't know how, but they sort of see what I do and they go, hey, you're doing it for the C-suite team. Why wouldn't you do it here? And so I do that. And then sometimes I'm just a lone ranger. I'm just, doing my own thing, working away, popping into the CEO from time to time. And I'm thinking, actually, I was down in Shannon in the west of Ireland on Monday, Tuesday this week, and I was working with a bunch of people in the business. And the CEO, I haven't seen her in, I'm not even sure I had seen her this year yet. And I went into the staff restaurant and she was there, and it was a sort of mid-morning and she was having a coffee, and I went over to her and it was just a quick catch up. We had no plan to meet, but it was, she was going, oh, you're on site, yeah. And like, she's the person I work with most, but actually she wasn't even aware I was on site because I was working on something over there, type of thing. So yeah, it's a bit of, for me, a bit of everything. I like working, I like going off and doing my own thing in the context we're talking about, and I also like being in teams. I'm also quite pragmatic. What sort of is going to make it work best. I don't like being in teams, even though I'm a top team coach. I don't like being in teams for their own sake. So
Yeah.
because even if I'm getting paid for it, I'm a sort of a team person if there's a reason.
Yeah.
But not for its own sake, ironically. And I do say that to top teams, like, you don't have to be a team unless you feel there's value, unless, we can create more than some of the parts type of idea. Yeah.
So did you have any other reflections that you wanted to add to that then, Charles?
I think what's very exciting for me is this, I call it line walking. You're inside and not inside the business. You're part of the business, but external to the business. And that liminal experience is incredibly powerful, but also is quite a skillful place to be. And I think you've exemplified, what it means to be skillful in that, which so many fractional executives need to learn. Because I don't think it's easy or obvious about how to be in that liminal place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I must take that for granted. I think because of my nature that we were talking about earlier, I think I came into this work that way. Like I'm never looking for a job. I don't think I'm particularly insecure. I know we all have levels of insecurity. I don't think I'm particularly insecure. So I'm really, and I also, as I was saying just a short while ago, I don't want to be involved in a business unless I'm genuinely adding value. So I'm often the person to challenge that idea. What's your perspective on that? Which is nearly giving them license to say, I don't know. Well, actually, should I be here? So what that allows me to do is actually, walk that line. And because having been a CEO, what I know is no matter how well I like somebody, and no matter how well I know them, at the end of the day, you're on my budget line. So, I'm, eventually, if I don't ask the question, somebody's going to ask me the question. And I want my colleagues saying to me, gosh, it's great having Dave around here, is adding so much value to what we're doing. That's what I want all the time, because I don't want, I just think it's not good karma, frankly. So it also allows me to be at my best, because my nature is to be, I think I'm a pretty easy guy to be around, but I'm a challenger. So I love cracking heads. I love a provocative question. I love to create new thinking. I like to create a bit of healthy discomfort, so to get breakthroughs. And I'm happy to ride alongside teams and CEOs when they're in their discomfort, knowing they're going to a better place. And I love to be with them when they bask in the reflected glory of saying, gosh, that was worth going through. I love that. For me, that's a bit like I'm imagining if I was a surgeon, it's like we got to do the surgery to get to a better place. I love doing that. And I'm often the person who's trying to get that to happen sooner rather than later. And often there's a trepidation around that. And, gosh, you can't go into the meeting and say, no, I'm going to raise that subject. I'll get that kicked out. We'll get that going. And often it's the CEO that's going, oh my God, you can't raise that. We haven't raised that yet. And we need, 2 more weeks before and 5 more meetings before we can raise that. And I trust my judgment. I'm not reckless. So I'd like to think I provide a little bit of safety around, getting to issues, cracking a few heads and getting, in a good, healthy, careful way. So I like that. And that's for me, real value added, and staying on the right side of the line. That's the side of the line I should be on. I don't want to become an insider.
No.
So the other thing I was going to ask is, I met you for the first time on this call, but Lorraine's worked with you. Lorraine, what do you enjoy about working with Dave? How does that enrich your experience as a fractional?
A lot of the things that Dave has actually described in terms of even just what he's just spoken about, dealing with the uncomfortable stuff and dealing with it in a way that's constructive and working through a process to get a positive outcome. And I can reflect on that, where I've had very explosive situations working with the decision makers around the table. But in order for us to move forward, we have to deal with the fact that there is not full alignment around the table in order to move things forward. Otherwise, everything is stuck. And I'm looking at this not from a top team's performing, although it is, of course, in that context. I'm looking at it in terms of there's an issue here that relates to the development of the brand and the culture with it and the strategy that underpins it, because that informs then how we move the business forward. It aligns with the business strategy. But I can relate to, and I can just think of a bunch of them off the top of my head straight away, where it has been a really uncomfortable situation and there have been explosive moments. But you would prefer if it didn't get so hot around the collar, that's for definite, but somebody has come to the table and they're carrying a load of things that they are feeling very heated about. But Dave has a very moderating influence in terms of, even if they are in safe hands, because even though it might feel like it's a very vulnerable place, and there are some aspects around the table that are just not in a good place. I have always felt in working with Dave that regardless of how fragile things might be at that time, and it's a short-term scenario, he will have them out on the other side in a much better place, and everybody will grow, and the business will perform, and the team will perform.
That's nice to hear.
But this, and also in terms of what you've shared then, Dave, brings me on to another thought here is flipping this around then. What advice would you give to that SME decision maker looking to hire that kind of fractional talent so that they can get the most out of the partnership?
Yeah, what advice? Be very clear. I mean, obvious one is be very clear on the why. You know, what's your bottom line here? And also be open to a potential fractional leader actually adding to that. You know, so sometimes I would go in and they're interested in something, and we build on that conversation and they see more possibility. So I think obviously have a reason, make sure it's a reason that, you know, you can get your head around, manage, be clear about, and be open to other possibilities as well. I think will be one. Chemistry will be another. You know, so I think chemistry is a huge factor. You know, is Dave or anybody the type of person we want coming on site and, you know, meeting our people? And because if you're the wrong person, you know, you're just going to be upsetting the apple cart. Well, frankly, by the very nature of the fraction, you're not probably going to be around that much. So I think getting the chemistry right, being fit, being of the right sort of character, know-how, obviously, but like, I don't mind saying, and I often say this to my clients, you don't know if I'm the best top team coach in the world, and you probably know I'm not. And I don't know that I am or I'm not. But it's not, because it's not about that. It's a lot of the time it's around the right character, the right chemistry, good reputation, word of mouth. Let's test this and let's test run this. And I always say that to people, don't make a commitment to me. That I'm not looking for a long-term commitment. If it turns into something long-term, that'll be good and healthy. If it isn't, fine. Yes, I do say to them, you know, I want to go on a journey. And I do think it depends on the nature of the work, but I think the fractional executive needs to be clear about what are they looking for? You know, why do you work? People sometimes ask me, why do I work? And I think I work for a range of reasons. I work because I actually want to do good work. I want to make a difference. I get my biggest reward is when somebody values what I do, and that makes me feel good about the effort and my professional integrity. That really, really does matter. The second is I like to get well paid for it, you know, so I position myself, you know, in a particular place in the marketplace, and you know, thankfully people see a lot of value in that. So that's great. And the other is it offers me, you know, and I say this to my clients as well, because it's this old phrase, you teach people how to treat you, is, you know, I like the nature of fractional work because I don't work 12 months of the year. I work 9 months of the year. Now, I don't take 3 months off in one go, but there's times when I'm saying to my clients, by the way, I'm not around in May. And they're not going, what? You know, and it's so when we're making arrangements and plans for the years, because they understand my universe. So I've had to teach your client how you operate, because what I discovered early on was you could be taken for granted very quickly. They assume you're under the end of a phone all the time. So just getting that right, to be fair to clients, you know, that if they're not used to it, that it's a very particular engagement and it needs to be contracted really well. And like all good partnerships, I have a little framework which might be helpful here that I came across years ago. And if you think of a 2x2 matrix, and on one axis is relevance, positive and negative, and across the bottom is relationship, positive and negative. So if you think of, you know, highly relevant but not a great relationship, they call that the supplier. Well, I never want to be a supplier, just as sort of a gun for hire. If it's high on relationship but low on relevance, you're a friendly face. You're a nice person, but like, yeah, you're a nice person, but like, do we need you? Will we pay you? Will we accept your invoice? And of course, up in the high relevance, high relationship is partnership. And in partnership, that's where I position myself. And I literally draw this out for clients. And I say, so let's just talk about how what a partnership looks like. And I co-create that with a client under 3 concepts, 3 needs. What are your needs? What are my needs? Because if you don't acknowledge my needs, the danger is we're going to come a cropper here very quickly. And what are our collective needs? What are the collective goals here, which we talked about earlier? So that's how I frame it with clients. And I literally use that model because I want a partnership relationship. I don't want to be, somebody saying we could get something cheaper for €100 less. And I go, oh, give me a break. So it's not, I'm not interested in that. They're entitled. It's their budgets. I respect that, but that's not the relationship I want. So that's would be the advice I'd give.
That's a great analogy too, to give somebody a frame of reference in terms of how to look at that as well.
Yeah. But I'm also wanting to, particularly that word supplier. My heart misses a beat when I hear the word supplier. Now, I understand it in business and you're part of our supplier network and you go on our supplier system. I get that. I'm okay with that. But it's like when we're having a relationship here, if you treat me like a supplier, then I'm going to check that, and we might need to change that in any way. Yeah. And I have had clients, incredibly good people, who just weren't used to the concept of a partnership with somebody like me, and I had to teach them what that looked like in a nice way. And they go, okay, get it. And it was about respecting my needs.
So really what you're saying is relationship times relevance equals partnership.
Yes.
Love it.
I've never heard it put that way, but that's, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So then looking ahead, Dave, how do you see the role of fractional executives evolving to help businesses navigate competitive and economic challenges?
We're living in I was talking to a client about this today, like obvious stuff, but when you look at what's happening geopolitically, for example, there's so much, the world is being turned upside down.
The question.
The world is being turned upside down. I bought the Financial Times on Saturday. Don't normally buy a paper on Saturday. And I opened up the pages and the T word was on absolutely every single page. And I'm not saying positive or negative to that, but it's just, we're so captivated by so many things that are going on at the minute daily that obviously businesses are having to consider that. So a lot of businesses I'm in are looking at how's that impacting them, what contingencies they need to putting in place, how does it change their strategies, all of those things. And I'm in some of those conversations and it's fascinating. And how serious do you take some of the, kite flying that's going on and so on. So against that, back to your question, I think, I'm sensing that there is a caution in the wider business world, which is, not quite a hang on here, but like we need to be very careful of the risks we're taking, and obviously the cost-based risks we're taking. So I think, potentially fractional executives are potentially more relevant. Yeah. Then there is the specialism piece, which is, for example, not one of my specialisms, but look at the advance of AI and a lot of organizations trying to get their head around the impact of that. Fractional executives into that space, trying to do very big, high impact things is going to be part of it. The other is change, just change itself. Is that I think a lot of organizations, I was with an organization this week that has come to the conclusion it needs to make quite a pivot that's going to be painful. Yeah. And it'll definitely have my involvement, but will it need other fractional executives involved to make the pivot at the speed it needs to make it, because of both the expertise required and actually just some of the day-to-day on the ground stuff that needs to happen. They need people there. Maybe they're sort of the initial thought. So I think we're more relevant than ever, to be honest. I also think I think there's a lot of small businesses bubbling up. So they, smaller businesses need this anyway. They just don't want to take on the fixed cost base. So there's more and more in amongst all this change. There's opportunity too. But I think, I think.
And I was sat in a room with over 1,000 leaders from about 120 countries and 45 US states, and Trump was speaking to them. And what I was really amazed about was, compared to when I was in the same thing last year, everybody felt radically different about the world. And for some people, this is the liberation they've been waiting for. And I don't think in the UK or in Europe, we really understand how much things have shifted.
Yes.
We've got no real concept of it. And this is not a small change. This is a tectonic shift.
Yeah.
And nobody knows what that's going to look like in the end. But if you think about it from a technology point of view, what they always say about technologies is everybody underestimates the impact, but overestimates how quickly it will happen. And I think that's what we're seeing with Trump,
Yeah.
and that's what we're seeing with the Chinese. And I think the hidden sort of maverick is actually what's going to happen with countries like Saudi Arabia, who suddenly have got huge amounts of capital with which they can start to change the world. So it's a really interesting time.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, I absolutely agree.
A very exciting time.
Yes, it is. It is. And I think, what both of you you're alluding to, and it's only striking me to say it now, is like I think a lot of the established norms are, you know, up for question, if not gone.
Yes.
And yeah, and that's for me, the way I see the world is that's an opportunity.
Yeah.
It's going to be very disruptive for people who want things to stay the same. But I mean, I've spoken to a number of people in the last couple of weeks, including in the US, who, they believe that this type of disruption is what's needed to get us to potentially to a much better place, not just business, but geopolitically. However, like any surgery, if I use that analogy again, it might be painful.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Big changes rarely lack some level of discomfort in getting there.
yeah, yeah. No, I think it's a huge, like, I also think it's a huge opportunity for people like me. And I say people like me, like I'm 62 years of age. I have a lot of experience. I've a great zest for life. I have a lot of energy. I love change. I love being in amongst all this stuff. And like I think anyone with some level of good experience and good energy and, sees the world and its opportunities and, is prepared to, I get energy from change, even if it's painful, like I do get energy from change. And I think if you're wired like that, I think there's lots of good things ahead. To be in the fractional executive space, for people who are, probably for me, probably in their 40s plus, there's a lot of good stuff ahead, lots of opportunity in areas that I can't even imagine.
So with the fox in the hen house, it's the free-range chickens that survive.
That's good. Good to hear. Good to hear.
Do you have any last questions to follow that, Charles? Because I think we're getting to we're getting close to wrapping it up here. Did you have any last? Because we definitely have had a very strong theme around hens going through this whole conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm going to park the avian flu conversation for another day. I'll
Good.
leave it with you, Lorraine, to wind us up before I make a fool of myself.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights today. Where can our listeners actually find you or learn more about your work as a fractional executive?
I mean, just hit my website, enableconsulting.ie, and you'll see all my contact details there, but also on LinkedIn. Hook up to me on LinkedIn and I will accept your invitation, and you'll see me under Dave Gribben and all my details there. That's the easiest way to find me. LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to find me, and just reach out to me. And that's often how people do reach out to me. I mean, all of my work, pretty much all of my work to date has been word of mouth, as people sort of hear about what I do. And what I always say to people is, look, we get an online call for 30 minutes together. We'll figure out very quickly whether we should be doing anything beyond that. And, that goes both ways. And I think that's always a lovely place to start. And, even if people have loose thoughts in their mind about something, I'm always happy to do that. The worst that can happen is I meet somebody for 30 minutes. That ain't a bad idea for the most part.
So don't forget to follow the Fractional Frontier for more episodes like this. And if you found today's conversation valuable, share it with your network. And thank you for joining us.
And make sure to follow us on LinkedIn for more exclusive content and catch the edited episode on all major platforms. And don't forget to subscribe. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, leave us a review or even share the episode with your network. So thanks for exploring the fractional frontier with us, where leadership knows no boundaries.
you.